Today's lecture is on handling data on OSG. And some of the topics that we're going to cover today are just an overview or things to think about when you are preparing to port your workflow over to OSG. And then we're going to talk about 4 different ways to handle files on OSG. So the HTCondor file transfer system that you've currently been covering, using a web proxy, how to use Stash, and then finally we're going to just briefly touch on some shared file systems. So when beginning to run jobs on OSG, it's good to think of things as kind of a spectrum, right? Whether you've previously run your analysis on your local machine or on a cluster, each step of accessing these resources takes more planning and more preparation in order to effectively utilize them. So what's some of the challenges when using OSG? Well, we can't control the cluster like our laptop, right? We don't have the ability to put software or files wherever we want. We don't have permissions to do that. And also, especially with OSG, there's this heterogeneity, right? So the resources are not always the same across OSG. And you also don't have the ability to do that kind of on-the-fly troubleshooting. You can't look into your job and see what's working and what isn't while it's running. But of course, we want to take advantage of the benefits of OSG. The thousands of cores that have accessible, the way that we can automate tasks with HTCondor and also DAGman, and also the way that it frees up your personal machine so that you can continue doing all of the other things that you need to do for your research. So take a moment, and I'd like everybody to just kind of think about what is big data to you. So working in this field of high performance and high throughput, we hear the phrase big data thrown around a lot. And one thing that's extremely obvious is that everybody kind of means a different thing when they think of big data. So big data can vary volume, what we call volume, velocity, and variety. That's 3 of the, I think we're up to 7 V's right now, maybe even 12 and 14, depending on which article you find. But each of those factors plays into what large or big data is for your research. So big data may be 1 million of 1 kilobyte or relatively small files, so a very large number of those, or it may just be a single very large file, like 1 terabyte. And each of these types of large data have different challenges when utilizing them. So before we get too further, I just want to define these 2 terms. Throughout this presentation, we're going to use the term input to mean any files that your job needs to run. And so this includes not only the input data for your analysis, but also things like software and any sort of supporting files that it needs. Also, we're going to have output. Output is anything that needs to come back from your job. So oftentimes there may be files that are created that you have no desire to use. We're going to kind of treat those as disposable. In addition to the output created from the analysis, we're also talking about error files and those sorts of things. So that planning that we talked about when you're jumping into doing your analysis, some things to think about are to start with your per job data needs. How much input does each individual job need? How much output do they each produce? How much data is created while the job is running? And once you determine those numbers, see if there's any way that you can minimize those things. Right? We want to cut our input and our output down to be just the bare necessities so that we're not transferring things that we don't need. Once you determine your per job needs, then scale that up and determine how much your entire batch needs, how many jobs you're going to run simultaneously. Because once you start running all of those at the same time, that output is going to multiply by the number of jobs that you're running. And then once you determine exactly what your data management needs, then you can look at what HTCondor and OSG data handling features will work best for you. So we talked about minimizing your data, and some ways that you can do that are to split large input. So for instance, if you're one of those researchers that has the single 1 terabyte size data file, each one of your individual jobs may not need access to that entire entire data set, right? So if you can find a way to divide your input so that it's smaller for each job, that will increase your throughput. Secondly is eliminating anything unnecessary. So that's input, output, at any of those steps, trying to find a way to only transfer what you need. Finally, the third thing to do is to consider utilizing file compression and consolidation. So consolidation kind of fits into that unnecessary data step, but that compression is very important. At any point where you're moving files or data, compressing those down, either using tar or zip to get them smaller, will help streamline things. So some common points are that input step right before your job's submitted, so you can transfer the inputs compressed. The output, so at the end of your job, compressing the files together and transferring them back. And then that step of moving data between whatever your local storage is to where you're going to be submitting your jobs from, and you need it staged there. So before we talk a little bit more about what methods are available on OSG, I'd like you to consider these types of data and how you would send them to a collaborator if you were working with them. So for instance, if you just had a sentence you needed to say to your collaborator, you might pick a pretty instantaneous way to communicate, right? You might type it inside of an email or send, a message on Slack or something similar to that. If you're talking about something a little bit bigger, say like a chapter of a document that you're working on, you might just attach it to an email, right? You're not going to copy and paste that whole thing into the body of the email, just like you wouldn't send it through Slack, most likely. So that's a little bit better way to send that information. And then, of course, if you're working on, entire dissertation with multiple chapters or even a book, you're not going to want to attach all of those multiple files to an email. So you might move up to something a little bit better like a cloud provider, say Google Drive, Dropbox, those sorts of things where you can upload it and then your collaborator can download it and utilize it as needed. And then finally, if you're talking the terabyte range, don't underestimate the ability to send large amounts of data through what's called sneaker net, right? Transporting it physically. So either through the mail, through driving it across, country, those sorts of things. And this is a very famous quote they have on the bottom by Andrew S. Tannenbaum. It says, "Never underestimate the bandwidth of a station wagon full of tapes hurtling down the highway." And there's as late as 2013, there's a really interesting analysis on there about how FedEx is actually faster than the internet. So if you want to Google that, you can find more information on it. And at some point, we may hit the point where transferring files electronically is actually cheaper and easier than sending them physically. But until we hit that point, that is still a viable option. I just want to also make note that that last one, the sneakernet, obviously is not a viable option on OSG. There's no way that you can physically export a hard drive to, any of the submit points and plug it in physically to a server. So we're really limited to those top 3 categories. All right, so these are the 4 options that we're going to talk about today, starting with the HTCondor file transfer system and moving up through shared file systems or local storage. And you'll notice that each step, they're really designed to handle more data. That's a little bit more outlined here in this table. So if we're looking to transfer like words, that's where you're going to transfer it within your executables, within your arguments. It's going to be kind of built into your workflow that way. So far, we've been using the HT file transfer to transfer up to about 100 megabytes per file. And then when you start venturing into larger sizes, I usually say about a gigabyte total, that's when you want to consider some of these alternate resources. All right, so just a little bit of a review of how HTCondor file transfer works. You've been working a lot with this past week. So remember, when you submit a file or submit a job, the input for the job, the executable needed, any input data sets are going to be transferred to the execute server with the information along with your job, and it's handled by HTCondor. Similarly, any output created inside that job directory is going to be transferred back at the end of the job. And that's great if you're submitting one job, but when we start scaling up and submitting several jobs, we're starting to put some pretty heavy load on that submit server, right? Suddenly we're talking about lots and lots of file transfers, especially for those input data sets. A lot of those will occur almost simultaneously as your jobs start executing. And then output are generally staggered a little bit, right? Because your job is going to finish up at different job slots at different. So as we talked about, that's generally at about a gig is a good size for the HTCondor file transfer. It's a good balance between speed and functionality. When you start looking at any input or output that's going to be bigger than a gigabyte, then you want to consider some of these alternate options. And the first one we're going to talk about is using a web proxy. So web proxy and Stash are generally what I recommend for anything over a gigabyte. The difference is that with the web proxy, we're going to be downloading it from a web server as opposed from Stash itself. So the way that this process works is the file will have to be on some sort of proxy configured web server, whether it's something you locally host or it's something publicly hosted. It's a place that has the file that you need that is accessible via an HTTP address. Right. So once you submit that, so in addition to having the web server, there are a number of web caches across the world. If you've ever run into a problem where a website doesn't load the most updated version in your browser and you have to refresh it or clear out your cache or re-access the fresh version, you've probably accessed a web cache. So what happens is these files that are stored on servers are then copied to caches across a geographical region so that they're closer to where you need to access them. That way, if you're hitting Google at the same time that someone else in your town is also hitting Google, you're probably not retrieving all of the information directly from Google servers themselves. So if we submit a job via HTCondor, our job will be transferred from the submit server to the execute server. And then we're going to pull that file down from the web server directly within the job. In doing so, the file will then be cached at a local web cache. And that becomes helpful because then in the future, when we go to access that file, we can access the cached version, and it makes that transfer a little bit quicker. To utilize web proxies in your within HTCondor jobs, you can actually just specify the URL of the file right within your transfer input files line, just as shown on the screen. What'll happen is then when the file transfer occurs within HTCondor, it'll pull down those files once it lands at the slot. Again, you can use pretty much any host or web server. It doesn't have to be something that you have local control over or something novel. It can actually be something already existing in place, but you really want to ensure that multiple downloads are permissible, right? Especially if you're queuing up hundreds and hundreds of jobs, each one of those is going to attempt to download the file. And a lot of public web servers have throttles or limits as to how many times you can do that. And that can cause problems when you're running your jobs. Because we're downloading these with an HTTP protocol, you really want to limit it to a maximum file size of about a gigabyte. There is some local caching at OSG sites with this. And so this is really ideal for shared input files, something that's going to be used for multiple jobs. Otherwise, that caching doesn't really help you much. And it's also really good for things like software. So if you have a zipped software tarball that you can download directly from the producer of the software, that can help. But one thing to keep in mind is that these files are going to be accessible to anyone who has the HTTP address, right? So this is definitely not a good option for any sort of, well, protected data or just something you don't necessarily want to be publicly available. So on OSG, you can actually place this on our web proxies by placing them in the public directory available on OSG Connect, and that's going to be in /public and then your username. Any files placed there will be available via the web address that's shown on the screen, stash.osg.connect.net/public/your username, and then the name of the file. So using a web proxy is fairly similar to using Stash. The nice thing about Stash is because it is managed completely by OSG, including the regional caches, we do have some special protocols that you can use to transfer those files. And so you can actually have file sizes up to about 20 gigabytes. It will support larger file sizes, but 20 gigabytes tends to be the peak of our patience level, right? At that point, they start to take too long to download or transfer. As mentioned, Stash does have a number of regional caches across the US that are owned and operated by OSG. Owned is a bad word. We manage them. And you can see on this map, the blue and the yellow dots are current cache sites. We do have several across the US as well as a couple internationally. And then there's a couple more that are planned in Europe. Stash is also very heavily used both by OSG Connect users, such as yourselves, as well as some of the national research projects that we support. So the gravitational wave experiment and the neutrino experiment are noted on the screen. Stash is available at a large number of OSG sites. The caches are located on very, like it says, fast networks. Many write directly on the internet to backbone. And Stash is good for both shared or unique data. Again, with the caching, shared data is, you get the most benefit out of using Stash, but you can also use it for unique input as well. All right. And one thing that I failed to mention with the web proxy that is important with that as well as Stash is that because of the caching that occurs, if you update some of these files on Stash, you'll want to change the name. So add like version 2, 3, or whatever to the end. That way you know that when you are accessing those files on the caches, you are getting the newest version and you're not accidentally accessing an older version, which can cause some unexpected side effects. So to use Stash, you're also going to place them into your public directory on OSG Connect, which is attached to the submit point that you're using, login 04. And then when you submit from any OSG submit site, that file will then be pulled down to the local or to the closest regional cache to the execute server that your job lands on. Then what happens is you can use this utility, the stash cp command, to download it from the cache. And now that it's closer to where your job site is, it's not going to take as long to transfer. And so that makes it a little bit more efficient. There's some changes that you need to make in your Condor submit file in order to access Stash. So you need to require stash cache by adding this plus once stash cache equals true line. And then you also have to ensure that the job slot that your job lands in will also have modules available to it. So in your requirements line, you need to include this has modules equal question mark equal true. So to utilize it within your job executable, you're going to load the stash cache module using module load stash cache, and then use the stash cp command. Stash cp operates very similarly to the Linux cp command, where you're going to specify the source file or the file you want to move first, and then name or location of where you want it to go second. So here we have stash cp. We're moving file.tar.gz, and then we're putting it into the local directory. One thing that you want to consider when you're using Stash is that at the end of your job, prior to termination, before it finishes, you want to remove any files that were transferred over, right? Because we don't want Condor to think that those are new files that need to be transferred back with the job, mostly because usually they are very large, and HTCondor transfer doesn't work well for them. And also, they're usually not needed. So you'll want to remove them out. So we can also utilize Stash for output. It's not just for large input. The difference is for output is we don't need to take advantage of caching, right? Because we're not going to be accessing that data again. Or at least we won't be creating duplicate output from our multiple jobs. If we are, then there's really no point in running it multiple times, correct? Also, a lot of those output files are created locally in the job slot, and so they aren't associated with your OSG Connect user. So there are some security issues there. And also, we don't want things to be always world writable, right? So when we were using the web proxy, we talked about how everything got a public address. You don't always want the world at large to be able to write onto our file systems. All right. So for output, again, we can utilize HTCondor file transfer, just like we've been using so far. We can also use stash. So to write output to stash, you're going to need the same changes to your Condor submit file. You need that want stash cache flag, as well as the extra modules requirement. And then in your job wrapper script or within the job itself, you're just going to utilize stash CP in the opposite direction, right? So in this case, we're transferring output.dat, and then we're putting it into our public folder. You'll notice, though, that the location of the stash write URL here is a little bit different than when you use it as input. So with each of these, as you move up this scale of data transfer, each step has its own kind of limitations, right, or extra concerns, whether it's publicly available data or quotas and sizes. They each have their own little level of complications. So you really kind of want to start with for lack of the easiest option available. If HTCondor file transfer is going to work for you, start with that one. If that's not quite enough, then slowly move up this spectrum to find the right one that will work. Okay, so some things to keep in mind, especially for stash and the web proxies, but this is really true of anything on OSG, is delete data when you no longer need it. That will keep your queues free or from filling up with unnecessary things, and it will also, in this case, help prevent our caches from reaching capacity. The last thing we're going to talk about are shared file systems. These are really appropriate when you have anything larger than 20 gigabytes. So we're not going to get into too many details on shared file systems just because we are limited on time. But basically, these are network-mounted file servers, and they're generally available on local submit and execute servers. So that is available on some submit sites. So for instance, on CHTC, there is a shared file system called staging that you can utilize, but it is not available on OSG Connect as a whole. So there's some limitations to using shared file systems, and that these really large data sets in the terabyte range may not necessarily be OSG friendly. So definitely go back and look at some of the tips and planning steps that we talked about, is to see if you can whittle things down to fit into one of these other options. There's more details on shared file systems on the slides provided on the website, but we won't be covering them right now. These last two slides are really just mostly as a quick reference for your information. These are quotas for the various data storage options available to you on both CHTC and OSG Connect. If these quotas are not sufficient for you, and you've already addressed some of the tips and challenges that we talked about, such as removing unnecessary files and discarding unneeded information or intermediate files in order to streamline and minimize your data, then feel free to contact one of these emails below. We can work with you to either find a good option for your analysis or to maybe bump up some of those quotas for you. And here's just a quick reference on the 4 different types of data transfer, as well as file size limits and how to access them.